Thanks for allowing us to come talk and sponsor. So Don't Panic Labs, I see some familiar faces out here from folks that we've worked with or that have been through some of our training classes. We're a software product development company who's headquartered down in the Haymarket in Lincoln, Nebraska. We work primarily with corporations, corporate innovation, corporate product redesign. We also work with a variety of startups and act as their technical co-founders. So kind of that's our early stage development. Lean software engineering is kind of our niche. And we also have some education stuff. So this, I know that, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I was actually at the talk where there was somebody here, I believe it was from Deliveron, is that right, Matt, you think?
I can't remember, but somebody. Yeah.
Kind of gave an overview of Service Fabric. I think it's probably been maybe a year ago or so. Sorry, I'm trying to advance. Okay. This is not going to be a repeat of that talk, in case some of you guys were there. How many people here are supporting production applications that are hosted in Azure Service Fabric? One, okay. How many people are in the process of developing applications that are targeting Service Fabric? Okay. This talk is primarily around some of the things that we are considering as a result of looking forward to doing more work in Azure Service Fabric. But to this point, this is part of my caveat, we're not currently supporting any production systems in Service Fabric. So I feel like I don't want to come across as a Service Fabric or try to promote myself as a Service Fabric expert. We've spent a lot of time evaluating this technology. We're looking forward to clients that this would be a good fit for. We're actually developing our own, we have our own product now that's under development, and it will be hosted on Service Fabric. But, you know, you can't be an expert on something like this unless you've actually been supporting a product in Service Fabric. And so I just wanted to, that's my one caveat. So this is going to be more about some of the things that we're thinking about as in terms of having Service Fabric be a target for some of our product development, because I think it's a little bit different, as you'll see. How many people are familiar with Service Fabric and the whole idea of, okay, got a handful of people, okay. And are you guys doing like reliable services, or are you doing some sort of container hosting or something like that? We are doing reliable. Yeah, okay. All right. So feel free to speak up with your own experience with this. So I'm going to start off by giving a kind of a walkthrough of Service Fabric. It seems like many of you are familiar with it, so I won't maybe spend a ton of time on it. But it's a pretty cool technology. So it's been around, so I think it was general release in March of 2016. And really it's Microsoft making available the infrastructure of Azure for people like us to build upon. So it's very mature. Microsoft spent years developing this technology. And when you're developing within kind of the prescribed environment of Service Fabric using things like reliable services, you are building on a true platform for service-oriented applications. It provides structure and discipline, which creates productivity for your development team. At least that's the promise. There's a ton of current services within Azure that are hosted and built upon Service Fabric. I think there's more and more coming online that are being built upon that. I have an article at the bottom here from the SQL database. Anybody using Azure SQL database? This article talks about the reliability and availability of SQL database and how Service Fabric is what's enabling that, because SQL database was built on top of Service Fabric. So it's a very mature platform. So when we think about some of the advantages to us, it creates this single integrated platform for development. It addresses the full software development lifecycle. So now we're not kind of picking and choosing, having to cobble together everything to go from development to DevOps and everything else. It's all baked into the platform. It does create constraints for you. You don't have unlimited choices, and our philosophy is that actually is a good thing. We feel like constraining the decisions we make it easier for us to stay on a successful path and to make the decisions to be confident that the decisions we are making are going to be consistent with the outcomes that we want. So it also, if you have a history of working within WCF, I think you probably have experienced a lot of the pain that can come along with WCF just in all the different options you have for configuration of WCF. Well, Service Fabric does not use WCF for any of its communication. It's obviously informed by what Microsoft learned about WCF, but again, they've really constrained a lot of the choices and keep you on this path, kind of headed towards the pit of success on this. It does enable you to target right out of the gate a single service-oriented platform that, with the experience you have as a developer, you're designing, building, testing, consuming, managing everything around Service Fabric. And another cool thing about it is that, because a lot of people get concerned about vendor lock-in. And with Service Fabric, you don't have, you're locked into a platform for hosting, but you're not locked into a hosting provider. Because Service Fabric is available not only in Azure, but you could actually host Service Fabric in AWS or on-premise. And actually, Microsoft gives guidance for how to actually host Service Fabric within Amazon Web Services. So it can be hosted anywhere. And this is probably something that we're not spending a lot of time on our side thinking about now, but we can see down the future, maybe 10 years from now, there is going to be a need for a lot more expertise and development around actor models and that whole programming paradigm, whether it's the Internet of Things or whether it's AI something. We're going to have to eventually start building applications that are using a completely different programming paradigm. For me personally, kind of switching between what I'm used to in designing services to going down this whole idea of now I'm going to decompose my system into actors. That's a bit of a leap. I just don't, it's not an immediate, I can just switch my brain to be thinking about that. And Azure is really anticipating that. It's not, I wouldn't say it's not a platform for hosting actor-based systems, but it is a technology on which you could build actor-based systems. Personally, I'm going to wait till it's a little easier to do that until we have some real-world needs for that programming model, but it's something to pay attention to. So when it comes to Azure Service Fabric development, the nice thing about the Service Fabric SDK is that I have this notion of a one-box development. I can do everything on my local PC, including hosting a Service Fabric cluster. So I don't have this dependency on having to build and deploy to Azure just to see my application running. And I did want to demo that here a little bit. So I'm running here. You're seeing this, right? So this is my Service Fabric local cluster, which by default would have 5 nodes. You can configure that, but a max of 5 nodes. And then I can actually then use the same Service Fabric Explorer targeting my local machine here to see what's going on my local cluster. So it's a really nice, complete, comprehensive one-box development environment. But while that's nice, that represents a bit of a challenge or some friction that I'll talk about in the second half of this, on the second half of this talk. And then within Visual Studio, so this is a solution design that's targeting Service Fabric. I can actually publish straight to my local cluster. I could actually publish to Azure from Visual Studio within here. All my deployment and packaging and configuration for hosting is defined within my solution here. So it kind of merges the DevOps into my one single solution. Everything is located here. Best practices wouldn't be that I would publish to my production environment from Visual Studio, but I could do that. All right. So It does represent, we feel, a modern service-oriented programming model that is highly prescribed. And it is important you'll have to embrace that. You can't fight these prescriptions. But again, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that it is incredibly capable of what it's offering to do. But you are going to have to, if you are not thinking of the world, if you don't see your world of applications in terms of composition of services, then there's going to be a bit of a mind shift you're going to have to make to that. So a little bit about the platform itself, which is probably will come as no surprise to folks here that have any experience with cloud architectures. But it is a modern cluster-based topology. And that doesn't just provide the scalability. I mean, Service Fabric is managing the reliability as well and availability. So it's already detecting whether nodes are compromised, and it's shutting them down and bringing up other ones. I mean, it's dealing with all of that for you. I think that that SQL database article talks a little bit about that, how the failover modes for SQL database happen, and how Service Fabric manages that for you. You can add and remove nodes dynamically. There's automatic load balancing that happens within here, and load rebalancing. And when it comes to the structure of applications that are hosted in Service Fabric, there's two units. There's this notion of an application, which I feel like is an unfortunate term for that. But then we have this notion of a service as well. And so applications contain services. So each one of these has a specific role, which I'll get into here in a second. So an application is kind of an organizational concept. This is what you publish, right? You publish an application out to Service Fabric. And what I've highlighted here is kind of the hierarchy that's going to compare and contrast the application from the services that are within the application. Your application can contain services, but it can also be an API. So services are kind of this compositional concept. So these are the components that interact together to provide the whatever features or capabilities within your system. And these are the units of scale. These are the things that you can control. I want n number of service instances of these types of services. And then Azure takes care of that all for you. So in general, now, talking about services, not talking about actors necessarily, but there's two types. There's stateless and there's stateful. And we're really only thinking in the world of stateless services. The applications we design all are designed and decomposed to be stateless or state-aware services. And by state-aware, I mean these services don't have any kind of persistent state. If they need state, they go out and get it, work on it, and then they're done with it. That would still be, in Service Fabric, that would still be defined as a stateless service. A stateful service, the state is actually maintained within the service itself, so it's not, and there's all kinds of other considerations around that. But the type of applications we build, I don't see that we really have a need for that. It would have to be a special case where we would need that. So if I had a system that was like an e-commerce system, this might be how these applications might be broken up. So when I see application, what I'm really thinking about is subsystem. That's why I was saying application feels like I understand maybe the need for them to name it that, but for me, I think of it in terms of subsystems. Because if I've got anything with any sort of size to it, I'm not going to be that I consider my application domain, I'm not going to be deploying that individually. That system's probably broken up into individual subsystems. And so, like if I had an e-commerce site, I might have 4 subsystems. One might be managing all the catalog operations. Another one might be managing all the order operations. Maybe I've got something around remittance to publishers, and I might have a notifications subsystem. And each one of those then would have a service or a collection of services under there. So this is just maybe more of a logical view. From a physical view, how that might be deployed across a 5-node clusters, I might have 3 instances of each of these services that Service Fabric that would then distribute across these nodes. I wouldn't be controlling that. I'm telling Service Fabric how many instances I want. It deals with all where these instances reside. So these things would be distributed. They would balance them across that. And of course, I still have access to all the other Azure services that are out there like SQL database. So it's not like everything has to run within Service Fabric. So in terms of the programming model, and I'm focusing really almost entirely on reliable services and not actors here. There's an API reliable service, and that would be a service that would be within Service Fabric that is designed to interact with the outside world. Because these other services are remoting services are not accessible from outside the Service Fabric world. And so if you don't have to have both, but if you've got like a website, which would be my example, I'm going to have an API services in there to host incoming requests from the outside world. And then I might have a series of remoting services behind there that are actually doing all the work. You could also host WCF services and some custom ones, but again, I think when you go down that path, you're losing some of the benefit you get of running within Service Fabric. If you're really trying to leverage the platform, you're staying within the reliable services in the API remoting area. So if I've got, going back to my e-commerce application, I might have instances of services that their whole role is just to host like a web API application that then is my API to all my other services. Okay. So a couple of things about programming in reliable services. One, it is an interface-based programming model. So if you're already kind of living in a service-oriented world, or think of the world in terms of composition of services, you're probably okay here. If you're doing dependency injection, you're already doing probably an interface-based programming model. You do need to use data contracts for your data transfer objects, and you have to use attributes on data contracts. You don't have to use the old service contract attributes that WCF required, though. As a matter of fact, they're not used at all within Service Fabric. And probably the biggest changes for us is all the methods within your remoting services all have to be task-based at this point. Those changes, I'm kind of representing that here. You have to convert everything to that. And like I said, if you're already building interface-based, loosely coupled, highly cohesive, service-based applications, you're probably in a good spot to be able to be targeting something like Service Fabric. If not, you're going to have to maybe change the way you're thinking about the world. So getting back to some of when we first were getting introduced to this, some of the things that we were thinking about when we started looking at what it takes to build a Service Fabric solution, a specific solution, and deploying to my local desktop. And thinking about applications we had that we might want to migrate there, or another consideration is, you know what? My old programming model where I've got projects within Visual Studio and I can just hit F5 and run them within IIS Express on my local machine or something like that, that's a really familiar, fast programming environment. There is more overhead to kind of pushing and publishing out to even my local cluster. It creates some friction there. And I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of that. And if I've got a developer who's working on just one service and they just want to write that service, run it run it against a console application, just that old familiar, very quick development environment, I'm not sure I want to hitch my wagon completely to running against my local Service Fabric cluster. Did you guys experience any of that in the development of your application? Were you guys developing all against a one box there on your local cluster on your local machine, or?
We do use local cluster on our local dev machine.
You don't?
We
You do use, yeah. I mean, how has that gone for you guys? Has it been okay? Is it?
Major challenge is it comes with its own learning curve, so it takes some time for everyone to understand how to
Yeah. Well, so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about some thought we put into how can I actually retain the best of both worlds. How might I obviously have to have my solution that is targeting a deployment to Service Fabric, and I probably still want to even deploy and do some testing against that on my local machine. But can I also retain that the old familiar environment that I might have? And maybe this is more important if we're just migrating an application. I may not just want to tear apart my old solution. So that's kind of the second half of this, to talk about this. So I call my legacy system my monolithic hosting. It's not a monolith in terms of one big gigantic class, but it probably was designed to run within a single process. And then how I might migrate that to target service fabric. So this is the example I have. So it's pretty simple. I have a console here that's representing some client, whether it's another website or maybe it's a mobile device. So it's kind of representing something that might be interacting with my web API that then interacts with my services. And I'm hosting all that currently, we'll say, in IIS. Excuse me. So a little bit of code. Is that even legible? Sitting up front. Sorry, I'll try to walk through this. So what this page is representing is my client, which is calling against my API just using the URL, and this is the controller and the method on my controller that it's interacting with. And I've got two methods here. I've got an add it, which takes two values and just adds them together, and I have a concat it, which takes two values and concatenates them together. That's my only my two features of my service. So, and then this is a pattern that's very similar to the way we do things in general for handling dependencies. We use more of a factory method for resolving interface dependencies, which is fortunate because it's essentially the same pattern that's required within Service Fabric. And then on my back end, my services, I've got an interface for my iCalculation Manager, and then I've got a concrete class that implements that on the right here called Calculation Manager. So I'm just gonna show this real quick in Visual Studio so you get a feel for what that looks like. So it's pretty straightforward. Here's my Web API client, which has the one controller for Calculation Manager in there, and I've got my contracts here, which define my interface and my DTOs, and then I've got my factory that resolves my interfaces to my concrete class here, and then I have some integration tests here that I still run. So, and I can even demonstrate that this works. So this is running on IIS here on my local machine. So adding two numbers, concatenating two values, one and one concatenated. All right, all running in IIS Express here. Okay. So now I'm going to create a whole new solution that's going to target Service Fabric for my services here. And so what's represented on the right is the whole other solution that I had to create in order to do this. Because you notice here at the bottom here of this special project here, that's actually the configuration and deployment project for my service, even though it has references back to the actual service that it's hosting or services that it's hosting up in the top half here. But the boxes here represent actual files that I'm referencing from my other solution. So I'm reusing some of the business logic, the main business logic, the DTOs, the interface, and the concrete class for the calculation manager in here. But I have to make those changes I talked about. One is the interface has to implement iService, which is in the Service Fabric SDK and namespace. And then I also have to convert all my methods to be task-based. They weren't that way before. Bigger change to my concrete class is, one, it has to inherit stateless service, and then you have to add some code here. Primarily, the bottom half of this is creating a listener that some of the services within Service Fabric use to manage the traffic of calls to your service. And then down below here, I might change my implementations to be task-based. So those are just minor changes I made to my actual business logic here.
So we move. Good evening. Yeah. Mood lighting.
Now I mentioned that remoting services like my calculation manager are not accessible from outside the service fabric. There are ways on my local machine I can access those directly, and that's what's done here. I've created a special test client that interacts directly, calls directly into my local services. And there would be a way to do this in Service Fabric itself too, but I don't know how useful that would be. It certainly is useful for me to create test clients in here that might be targeting the services that are hosted on my local machine. So this is what this would look like on my local machine when I deploy here. It creates 5 instances of my calculation manager. And this is that special test client I have. Actually, it would be outside the cluster on my local machine, but in order to run in Service Fabric, that would have to be effectively running within the cluster. So this is what this looks like in Service Fabric Explorer. So now here's my calculation application, my calculation service, and it's on 5 nodes within my local cluster. Again, this is all against my local machine. So this is I can run my remoting client here, calling directly against my Service Fabric running on my local cluster here. Works great. All right, at this point, since I've changed those classes and I've made references to namespaces within the Service Fabric SDK, my old solution's broken. It's not going to build because it doesn't have a reference to the SDK, but that's okay for the moment here. I'm going to continue on and migrate my web API into the solution as well. So here again, there's a separate project for an ASP.NET Core stateless web API service as opposed to just a regular stateless service. And here I bring in my controller from my previous project into this project. And then I also bring in the web client in here as well, just to make it easy for me to test within here. And the changes I have to make to my controller is I have to implement that Service Fabric service proxy to resolve my interface to an actual instance on one of the nodes here when I'm making a call. And so this is how, if you're not familiar, this is how you address specific services within Service Fabric, and then there's a naming service that resolves that to an instance of a node. And with stateless service, it just picks any of the nodes. If you were running stateful services, then there's some more information you have to provide in order to say what is the, depending on how your data is partitioned within your state how your state's partitioned, you have to provide a little more information. All right, and then within my mobile client that I had, I created a config file just to kind of abstract the URL because targeting the API in Service Fabric was different than targeting the one in my IIS. So I just tried to make that hide those configurations a little bit there. So this is now what I look like on my local machine. I have my 1 instances of it may not be on node 1, I don't really control that, but this is what it should look like in my Service Fabric Explorer, which I'll show you here. So I have my 1 instance of my API here. It's on node 3. Okay. So I have my application running within Service Fabric at this point, and I can prove that here by running my web client running against that web API, which is then interacting with my calculation manager within Service Fabric. Everything's great. All right, but what about the monolithic solution? What if I still want, for whatever reason, I still want to have that old familiar development environment? I had to believe that it wasn't necessary that we had to just dump all that and just only be targeting a Service Fabric solution. So we're able to do this fairly easily using some things that we haven't used before. One is using linked domain logic code. So rather than those examples here, you might have noticed that this has a special symbol there. See that? Has anybody used this before? Basically, what I've done is I've added a link to that actual file as opposed to importing the file. So it's actually this is pointing to the same physical file in my other solution that was in the other solution. So if I make changes over there, they're going to be reflected here and vice versa. So that's one thing we've done. So now no matter where I'm editing my business logic, it's going to be reflected in both solutions. And then here was maybe the more esoteric thing we did. We use partial classes to hide the hosting specific logic, and I'll demonstrate this a little bit for you. And then we also used hosting specific factories in each one. So each solution has its own factory. And so in my traditional one, it used our traditional, however we resolved those dependencies. And in the Service Fabric solution, it uses the service proxy from the Service Fabric SDK. And the business logic around that doesn't know. It looks the same to them. So I'm going to walk through that a little bit. So this is, the top part represents my interface that is shared between the two projects. The bottom part represents a partial class that only exists in my Service Fabric project. And so it's the one that implements the iService. All right. So it's a little weird. I have a partial class for iCalculation Manager in my other one, and I only have one partial class there, but it works fine. For my concrete class, again, the top one is the one that is the file that's shared between them, and the bottom one is the one that's specific to, that's only resides within the Service Fabric solution. And it's the one that inherits from stateless service and also implements then all the Service Fabric specific logic there. And then this is the example of having two implementations of our factory. The top one is the factory that exists within our traditional, our monolithic solution that uses we'll call it our standard interface resolution logic. And the bottom is the one that implements the service proxy. And so our controller, which is also a shared class, we're not doing any partial class stuff there, but now that we have, it's using this manager factory, and I could have put this service URI, which needs to be there. I could have put that in a config file so that it wasn't kind of polluting my code here, but I left it here just so you kind of could see the full thing here. But they're both, this is a shared file, they're going to work in both environments. When it's running in the monolithic solution, it's using the factory that was in there. When it's running in the Service Fabric solution, it's using the factory that's there. So let me show that real quick. Here is this is the Service Fabric solution that has my partial classes here. This is the one for the iCalculation Manager. Looking for I might not see oh yeah, right here. And this has the partial that's put for my concrete classes in here. And then I have my own manager factory here that's only this. So remember, these are the files that are shared between the two projects. And then my old solution looks essentially the same. It looks fairly untouched, except for if I go in here and look at the calculation controller, now it's using this. It's using this new. I've modified this a little bit, and if I look at my calculation manager, you see it's a partial class. And ReSharper does highlight it and say it only has a single part. I get it, but it's not. Doesn't cause any problems there. So now I could. This application here, the other one's already running in Service Fabric on my local cluster. This one I could run against IIS Express here, just like I was before, and use my more traditional development environment there. So it was kind of just an interesting kind of thought process to work through to try to figure out, how we might be able to do this. Can I tell you this is super critical for us to do it this way? I don't know. Like I said, we're still kind of moving in that direction. My gut tells me there's going to be a point in time where we're going to want to be able to use our more traditional development environment. And so it doesn't feel like there's a lot of additional overhead to be able to provide that environment plus the Service Fabric solution environment. Plus, I could have just developers that don't know anything about Service Fabric just working in here. I might have a whole other team that is managing the solution, right? I could have people or just my DevOps folks that are dealing with that side of the application and maintaining that solution. So I can have my two, I could be functionally separated here and not have people stepping on each other for that. So there are use cases where I see where this could be valuable. I wasn't surprised when I asked the question how many people, I was actually surprised that somebody here actually has something in Service Fabric in production, because I'm not hearing a lot of talk around this, but I do think it's inevitable that we're all going to have systems that are hosted within that environment. For us, it's been just finding the right application need for that. Because I mean, we're definitely not a group that says, well, Service Fabric just came out, so everything we do is going to be hosted in Service Fabric. We just don't see the world that way. But we do see systems that would, when we have talked to certain clients, we're like, this is going to be a good candidate for Service Fabric. This makes sense for them. Now, there are other options for doing essentially what I was doing there. To be able to, like, if you want to prepare yourself for Service Fabric, but you're not ready. Maybe you want to continue to host your application locally, but you know at some point it's going to make sense, or maybe you're in development now and you need to go live before your IT ops team is ready to support a Service Fabric system. Whatever your reason may be, you could use the solution kind of we've come up with here, which is I think fairly naive. There are other resources out there. There's an organization called iDesign that was heavily involved with WCF development, and actually the principal there wrote kind of the definitive book on programming WCF by O'Reilly. He developed, within that book, he talked about a whole set of code that kind of took the rough edges off of WCF, and he calls it Service Model EX. And he would tell you it's everything WCF should have added in, but never did. Well, those same guys extended that to Service Fabric. And what they're doing, they're emulating the SDK of Service Fabric. And so you can do all the stuff and reference that. All the stuff I did with partial classes, I wouldn't have to do that if I was using Service Fabric or Service Model EX.Service Fabric, which is a set of code. It is only right now, it does have a dependency on WCF, so if I was doing .NET Core, I wouldn't be able to use that. But I do think these guys are probably going to come out with a set of SDK emulation classes that would support .NET Core, and I think they'd probably call it Service Fabric EX. So if you're interested in that, all their stuff is free to download. I put the URL there. And then I also think Microsoft is eventually going to have to kind of improve some of the programming experience of this. And I think you've seen, if you've kind of followed some of the changes to the SDK, certainly early on in that first year, there were some breaking changes that were happening within there that, things we were trying to deal with. How do you deal with ambient context? How do you get that to transition out of band? And we found a way that we could do it with, I don't remember what the version was, but then they removed that capability that we were using in the second release of the SDK, which broke that. So it does feel like that there's some rough edges around Service Fabric that I got to believe Microsoft's going to make it that much easier. But so you can probably stay tuned for that. So that's what I got. I would entertain any questions, but like I said, I know something about Service Fabric. I more think about Service Fabric in terms of what's it going to do for us in terms of just how we're developing applications and productivity and things like that. Yeah.
So I'm going to start out with the topic. With regards to the cluster, is that region locked, or can you have multiple nodes within your cluster in different regions of Azure?
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I presume you're able to have clusters across regions, but a single cluster is going to stay within a single region, right? Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, you said you can host APIs in Service Fabric. And you can also have WCF services in Service Fabric? correct?
Yeah.
Can you expose a WCF service as an API? Or does it always have to be a REST, HTTP REST-based API?
I don't know
I
the
want to make a SOAP connection.
I don't know the answer to that. It wouldn't surprise me if you could. I don't know the answer to that. I could get back to you on that though. Yeah. Because I think a lot of the constraints that are in there for reliable services, you lose some of that. You lose some of that restriction when you go outside of reliable services with things like WCF or doing some custom. You guys didn't do any WCF hosting, and yeah.
Even though you can, you may not want.
Right. Right. Any other questions that I can't answer? Yeah. An unfair question? I thought this question was unfair.
Yeah, it was.
Does anybody know if there's any comparable technologies in the AWS space?
I'm not aware of anything there. Now, you could host this in AWS. That's right. So that's the thing. Yeah, we do some stuff in AWS. We do some stuff in Azure. We haven't done anything in Google, although I had a call with Google this week because I'm kind of curious. They have some cool services that I think we'd like to take advantage of. But yeah, I'm not aware of anything that directly correlates to this. Especially when you get all of the reliability, the availability, all that stuff that happens. I mean, for me, I'm thinking, oh, I can target a platform that is exactly what Microsoft is building other Azure services on. To me, that if I'm thinking that I need something that I have the ability to have them manage scale, reliability, availability, it just seems like a huge win for a company to not have to deal with a lot of that pain. So, that wasn't that unfair of a question, though. You have another?
Sorry.
No, go ahead. It's you.
Oh crap. the cluster. You mentioned there's a max of 5 nodes. Is that correct?
That's just on the dev
On the
dev box.
But you get, and those nodes are in a way scalable to load and need, or is it something you have to initialize in your cluster as you're creating it?
Right, you're defining that within the cluster creation.
Okay.
Was that somebody else dealt with that on your project?
I didn't understand.
Oh, his question was, can you dynamically change the number of nodes within your cluster, like if you were in Service Fabric? I don't know that you can. I think you create a cluster. I think
that's like a Windows cluster.
I don't.
Here is
Yeah, there's ways to change it. Yeah.
Here is the concept behind service. So all those nodes run as under VM scale set.
Yeah.
So that service cluster utilize VM scale set plus all
Okay.
those nodes.
Yeah. Just wrapping my brain around it.
Yeah. I think a lot of those elements of Service Fabric are pretty familiar to people who are dealing with that type of management.
As far as I've seen, we cannot do it dynamically.
All right. Any comments or anything either? Okay. Well, thanks for having us. And
Yeah, thanks for.
yeah, you bet.